how do you pay for the progressive policy agenda? All of these wonderful, bold, transformative ideas that we know will be impactful and meaningful in people's lives. Where does the money come from? How do we pay for it? And the traditional answer from the mainstream of the economics profession has always been, well, it would be nice to have all of these things, but it's too bad we just don't have the money, because the money comes from two potential sources. The federal government can either tax the population to pay for it, tax the rich, tax polluters, tax the wealthy, and all of that stuff. Or we can borrow from financial markets. So the government issues bonds, US treasuries. But the problem with borrowing is eventually the government will have to pay for it, right? So eventually, sooner or later, we're going to have to tax somebody and spend less, tighten our belts in order to pay for the national debt. Well, the problem with this explanation is that it has nothing to do with the reality of how the federal government actually spends. This so-called sound finance approach, which usually refers to how you and I spend, right? You and I are users of the dollar. We don't create it into existence. So you and I have to work hard, earn an income first, then we can spend it. And we can spend beyond our income potentially if we borrow from a bank or a friend or a credit card company. But then we have a real debt, and that's a real financial burden that we must pay at some point, either by earning more income, working harder, or spending less, or doing both. So that is true for you and I. That is true for businesses, for nonprofits, for your states and municipalities. They too have to spend and live within their means. But the federal government, the sovereign issue of the currency, doesn't have to follow the same principles because it can spend its own money into existence, which means it can have large deficits. It can have a large national debt without necessarily causing bankruptcy or causing hyperinflation or any of that. So that raises the question, what is the actual limit of spending that the government has?
Because MMT never. People jump in on this and they're like, people mock this and say, oh, those progressives, they think we could just print all the money we want and just put out all this money. And that does sound not correct, right? Like it sounds kind of, how can that be true? But yeah.
Right. And I when I explain this, I always have to repeat it twice just to make sure everybody heard me, that I never said, and anybody in the MMT community, we never said that government spending is unlimited, that the printing of money is unlimited. There is a real limit, but the limit is not tax revenues, and it's not the borrowing that financial markets will allow the government to have. That is true for states and municipalities, not for the federal government. The real limit to how much the federal government can spend is the risk of inflation, the potential risk of inflation. Right. So now we're talking. So then what determines that risk of inflation? How do we know where that limit is? Well, it has two potential sources. One is we can have inflation if the productive capacity of the economy, the number of skilled people and machines and equipment and real physical resources is limited. Once we exceed that limit, then we get into the inflation pressure point. The good news about that is that productive capacity is producible. We can train more doctors and nurses and engineers and teachers. We can build more hospitals and ventilators. And the good news is that it produces millions of jobs. But it does require strategic planning. We can't just walk into it and hope for the best, right? We have to plan. We have an industrial policy. We have to have healthcare policy, educational policy. This is where you can actually expand the productive capacity strategically without bumping into that inflation limit. So that's sort of the easier part of the strategy. The next part, the source of inflation that really matters, that many of us in the progressive movement and many people have campaigned for on this front, and this is very important for us, is the risk of inflation that is derived from having too much market power, abusive pricing behavior. In other words, you have companies who actually can raise prices, cause inflation, simply because they can. In other words, because lawmakers let them. Think of the health insurance companies, think of Wall Street, big pharma, big oil, big tech. All of these companies have too much corporate power. And the reason they have it is because the lawmakers that we elect to Washington, D.C., who have the responsibility to tax and regulate those companies and to democratize the market have essentially abdicated that responsibility, because their elections depend on super PAC money and campaign contributions from those who control the market. So now we have a problem, not just in the economy, not just in terms of inflation. This is a problem for democracy. So how do we tame that risk of inflation? We can't tame it by saying, oh, we shouldn't spend because we'll go bankrupt. The only way to tame that risk of inflation is by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence. And that takes 535 people who are willing to do it in DC.
Right.
And so now if you do that, I'll finish here, you actually push that potential risk of inflation further and further away, and you stop the suffocation of the economy, which is what we have right now. So that's how we pay for all of these progressive programs. And it's not, I'll close with this one, because a lot of people say, well, we told you so, we need to tax them so we can have the money. No, 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 no. We don't need to tax them. We don't need their money or their permission to have a Green New Deal. But we should tax the hell out of them, right? Not because we need their money or their permission, because we want to decarbonize the economy, tax oil companies and fossil fuel companies. We want to stabilize the system, the financial system. We should tax speculation out of existence. We should tax the ultra-rich oligarchs, not because we need their permission, but because we want to protect democracy from oligarchy. We want to reduce their power and influence in politics. So that's what it means when we say take money out of politics. It's not because we need their money. It's because we need them to get out of the system so we can have a true democracy where we have a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not a government of the super PACs, for the super PACs, by the super PACs.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.